Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, December 1st, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about a brand new memo acquired to Politico from the Texas GOP Senate primary, showing that the Texas Senate race for the Republican nomination in 2026 is shaping up to be a very interesting race, especially for incumbent Senator John Cornyn, who only leads the three-way bracket against Representative Wesley Hunt and Attorney General Ken Paxton by 2 percentage points in this three-way race, reaching 35% across the state. Not at all the number you want to be at as an incumbent, a race that shows that John Cornyn cannot even be saved in, get this, his own internal. Yes, this is an internal poll sponsored by John Cornyn's campaign that has the focus of trying to elevate John Cornyn for Senate in 2026. If you know the purpose of these polls, you'll know that this is oftentimes meant to bring in donors, bring in confidence, and show that to the public and to those who are interested parties that the Republican Party and John Cornyn have a strong chance at winning re-election in 2026. But this poll doesn't really scream that. If anything, it shows a lack of confidence, especially given that the data tells us that John Cornyn in an internal, which I have no doubt in my mind, was led and asked in a way that benefited Cornyn, sampled in a way that benefited Cornyn, presented in a way that benefits Cornyn, shows him with just a 2-point lead on the statewide average in this three-way race. And, looking at the 2026 Senate race in Texas, a lot of people's concern on the GOP side is largely come down to whether or not John Cornyn can even make it through a primary. Somebody who has been an incumbent in this seat for as long as he has, winning re-election in 2020, winning re-election in 2014, winning re-election in 2008, winning re-election in 2002, or winning election in 2002, John Cornyn was able to get into this race in 2002, win it and dominate it, but now the voters on his side of the aisle are not all that thrilled with him on the political front. The GOP primary between Ken Paxton and John Cornyn has been tumultuous for a while. Ever since 2023, Ken Paxton has kept it an open secret that he intended to challenge John Cornyn for the U.S. Senate bid in 2026. The real question was whether or not John Cornyn decided to withdraw from the race and ultimately throw his support behind a successor that he felt could beat Ken Paxton and win a general election. But rather than do that, John Cornyn himself wants to run for the seat. Again, he's been serving for quite a long time, and so there is a real purpose in trying to stay politically relevant and politically involved in this seat. But rather than run a strong enough campaign that he comes out with an advantage, all of these endorsements from Congress people across Texas, state representatives, mayors, labor unions, U.S. senators, and even former secretaries under Donald Trump's first administration, he still doesn't seem to be clearing the numbers that is necessary for voters to feel confident about him in a runoff election or a primary, even in general. And that's really what I'm getting at here. The Republican Party desperately wants it to be John Cornyn. If you look at the list of endorsements, you'll find that it is really everyone on the establishment front for the GOP. You have John Thune, you have John Barrasso, you have top names who are leaders on the Senate side in the GOP, and also those, who have influence, outsized influence in the state of Texas and really try to push, the voters to back John Cornyn because they see him as the most electable. And even with all this support, Ken Paxton, who, pales in comparison in terms of endorsement, has just 2 endorsements from 2 relatively new congresspeople, as well as 1 former state representative, and also 2, in terms of organizations, is limited to the Republicans for National Renewal and Gun Owners of America. But beyond that, you don't really have that many other people. And that makes a difference in races like these, because you'll see in a traditional race, Ken Paxton lacking in these endorsements would typically doom him. But as it's mentioned so far, we know that he is not doing as well in endorsements, and yet it is John Cornyn who is the Republican lagging behind. To be quite honest with you, this race should be a wash for John Cornyn. It should be easy. He should be easily dominating this primary field, winning by margins that you could not believe, but that's not what we're seeing. Ken Paxton is within striking distance of a senator who's been in office since 2002, which just so happens to be the year that I was born. Someone like that who has been serving as long as he had, simply being unable to get more than 35% in his own internal, really shows how desperate this campaign has gotten. And they make the argument that Wesley Hunt must leave the race, saying it would be an embarrassing loss in March for Wesley Hunt, and it puts him in a precarious position against Ken Paxton and John Cornyn, especially that Wesley Hunt would be vacating his seat in the House of Representatives if he is to run for Senate. Now, the internals here are a bit shaky. One shows John Cornyn winning, but another from Wesley Hunt also says that Wesley Hunt pulls ahead of John Cornyn. But the clear person who Republicans are in opposition to and very clearly is doing well in this race is Ken Paxton. The numbers here aren't great. John Cornyn has fielded internal polls before, and none of them show him doing as well as he would like. In fact, none of them, on the average, have John Cornyn leading. That's quite bad for the GOP, and it shows in the results. Especially given that right now, the data is quite wonky. John Cornyn obviously should be leading, but the fact that he isn't is a telling sign of what his chances are in an eventual runoff election. In the event that no candidate clears 50% in a primary, which clearly nobody is even close to 50%, the top two contenders in a primary in Texas will face off in a runoff election roughly 2 months later. The primary is set for March, and the runoff will be set for May. And what we will probably see in that runoff election is that Ken Paxton and John Cornyn will make it to the runoff. And in that runoff election, it is very possible that because John Cornyn has been running a a very negative campaign against many of his opponents, that it is an establishment pushback effect where a lot of voters end up, going against John Cornyn simply by nature of him being the incumbent and backing Ken Paxton as a result. With Wesley Hunt out of the race, one of these two candidates is guaranteed to cross 50%. Without it, it heads into more uncertainty and a very interesting campaign of Ken Paxton likely courting Wesley Hunt. Because after all, why run against an incumbent unless you feel that incumbent isn't up for the task? It's different that Ken Paxton is running and Wesley Hunt is too if it was an open race. But it's not. They're openly going against the incumbent, and voters too, who have been faced with the option of John Cornyn since 2002. The majority of them are choosing other people, which is why it's just all around not a good sign for, this race. And also, too, what the poll recognizes is that Wesley Hunt has seen, a lot of money entering into this, but they have also been facing their own challenges on the negative front, and voters are largely abandoning Wesley Hunt, at least according to this internal. The Houston media market, which is a huge part of the Texas Republican primary electorate, shows that Wesley Hunt this is the area he represents, goes from being at 33% in terms of Houston area support down to 24%. It is Ken Paxton who has gained the most. And I honestly see this as a very negative thing for John Cornyn. In the time where you see that, Wesley Hunt has been losing support, it has been nearly directly translating to Ken Paxton statewide. But I think that the idea here for John Cornyn is that rather than have to go negative and face off against two opponents, it's easier to go off against just one. They have been successful to some degree in dropping the approval rating for Ken Paxton. Voters largely adored him on the Republican side, and now it's starting to be a bit more shaky. But you can really only do so much. Ken Paxton's favorability rating, despite this being quote-unquote a massive success for the Cornyn team, John Cornyn's approval rating is still lower than that of Ken Paxton, and the unfavorability rating still higher. It's tricky, and it certainly isn't something that makes me, as someone who's looking at this from that analytical point of view, that John Cornyn has this in the bag whatsoever. They're struggling to keep their star candidate in this race because voters just quite frankly don't want him to be their next senator, even if it means an easier general election. And the general election will be more difficult without John Cornyn, no doubt about that. John Cornyn has outperformed every single top-of-the-ticket Republican in every single election that he has run in. And looking at the last time that a Senate race was this competitive was in 2018 when Ted Cruz defeated Beto O'Rourke by 2.6%. Yes, you read that correctly, 2.6%. That's it in Texas. And if it does end up a situation where, because the Republicans, again, are struggling, as their own internal data seems to suggest, the Democrats could be in for an exceptionally strong race, where James Tellerico on the Democratic side, if he is the nominee, runs against Ken Paxton in an election where the odds for the Democratic Party are no less than 33%. And I think that, it is really interesting looking at just what Democrats and Republicans, at least on their end, have expected about this race, which is that almost all of it comes down not just who the Democrats nominate, but also to who the Republicans nominate to. that, Ken Paxton as the Republican nominee would be leagues ahead of what the Democrats could have hoped for when it came down to the GOP nomination front, and they know that that would be quite bad for the GOP and quite beneficial to the Democratic Party. And I think that, looking at 2026 in general, especially based on what we see tomorrow in Tennessee and what we see across the 2025 races just in analyzing those, there is no room for error on the Republican side. And yet, they are finding a way. And their star candidate, their number one guy, John Cornyn, is the face of it. As an incumbent who's been serving in the Senate for over 20 years, can't even get the majority, sometimes even a third, of his party on his side in a Texas GOP primary. And although he may be the most electable, the voters on the primary side don't seem to care. And that has been the pitfall and the bad thing about the Republican primaries that have been taking place in this Trump era, but it also has been the saving grace for Democrats on the national, statewide, local, and congressional level for many of the past years. And looking at the Senate race in 2026, this race with John Cornyn falling out of favor may not be all that different. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.